Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to The Wrap. I am David Gillette. Yeah, there's the moose call from Jim Crone over there. Well, thanks for watching tonight, everybody. So with all the talk in the news lately of this animal right here, the moose, potentially going on the endangered species list, you're going to hear a lot of talk about that list that we've all heard about before. But we figured a little primer on how this thing actually works would be really valuable. So we asked an expert in tonight, and you saw her on the show. It's Colette Adkins, the senior attorney from the Center for Biological Diversity. And you spend a lot of time working with the endangered species list, don't you?
Yeah, I sure do. Yep, I'm a lawyer for the organization, and that's what I do.
So let's get under the hood on this law. First of all, just how does something go onto the endangered species list? How does that process begin?
Well, it can start by the agency itself deciding to put an animal on the list, or a citizen can do it. Any person can. In the center, we certainly have petitions for hundreds and hundreds of species.
So how does a citizen do it? Is there a website you click on, or do you just tweet out that you want to propose it? How do you start that?
Well, it's a scientific document that you prepare that lays out the threats and the status to the species, and you make the best case that you can for why that animal deserves protection under the Act.
And that case ultimately gets to the agency, right?
That's right. Yep.
But then when the decision has to be made, who's in that room? Who are the people who decide that?
So it's Fish and Wildlife Service biologists. This is the federal agency that's tasked with protecting our endangered species.
It's as simple as that.
It's as simple as that.
What is the batting average of an animal that's proposed and makes it to the committee to come out the other end as endangered?
I don't have the statistics on that. There's actually a couple different options that can happen. The agency can go ahead and propose it to be listed, but they could decide that it deserves listing, but that they aren't going to go through with it then, and put it on what's called a candidate list. And there's actually hundreds of species that sit on that list, deserve protection, but just don't get it.
You mentioned a bit of this on the program, but what's the benefit of being on the list? I mean, we don't hunt moose in Minnesota, so what added protections are there?
Yeah, well, for many species, the prohibition on take, that's where you just can't kill, you can't capture, you can't harass, is a really important protection. So turtles, for example, that might be collected for the pet trade. And there are moose that are hunted still in North Dakota. Habitat protections, getting critical habitat designated, development of recovery plans, setting aside this full roadmap of all that it takes to get the species on the road to recovery and eventually off the list.
Is this list U.S.-centric? I mean, we think we appropriate it here in America, but does it have international implications? Does it have reach beyond our borders?
It sure does. We can put on the U.S. endangered species list animals all across the world, and that does have implications. For example, just last week, the news was made about ivory imports, and elephants are listed as endangered species, and we can restrict the imports then. Animals
sometimes move off the list. How is that process initiated? Is it another citizen request, or how's that done?
It's the same thing. So the agency can do it themselves, or you can petition to delist.
So I'm wondering, and this is, you can tell me if you want to weigh in on this, but at the end of the day, is the endangered species list, is it a political process or is it a scientific process?
Well, the Endangered Species Act is very clear that those decisions can only be made on the best available science. It's an absolute mandate. Political considerations cannot weigh in on whether or not a species gets listed. And that's a lot of the reason why our organization wins lawsuits, because sometimes political considerations do make their way into that process illegally.
So in reality, it is a pretty steady process. I mean, whatever administration's sitting in Washington, it's not one of these things that kind of ebbs and flows with the political tides. Is it truly steady?
No.
That's what I was getting at, because I had a hint that it wasn't.
Yeah,
maybe.
It really isn't. It should be, and that's the way that Congress envisioned this act working, is that it would be really driven by science, but unfortunately political considerations do make their way in.
Just two questions left. First of all, the moose, specifically here in Minnesota, do you think the moose will make it? You want to prognosticate?
Make it onto the list? Yeah, I really do think they will. We've seen more than half of our moose lost in Minnesota in less than a decade. The DNR has warned that while the loss isn't quite as dramatic in the last year, we're still seeing moose decline. I think they'll get on the list. They need it. It's really the best tool we have to save them.
And for you, Colette, personally, what's the animal or species you're really hoping that's on the list now that will get off the list? And you can't pick this one because we've been talking about this a lot today. Besides the moose, what's the species you're really hoping will make it off the list?
Well, someday I would love to see wolves recovered across the country and eventually removed. It's a species that I've worked on for many, many years, and it's close to my heart.
Okay, we'll be watching. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Nice
and
to meet
that is all the time we have for The Wrap. Now's the time for the moose sound effect if we have it. We'll see you next week.